And welcome to a special edition of the Vital Living Forum. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Paul Nussbaum. Dr. Nussbaum is a clinical neuropsychologist who specializes in aging across the lifespan and brain health. With a home base in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Dr. Nussbaum maintains an adjunct professor of neurological surgery at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. He provides national and international lectures on the human brain, brain behavior, diseases of the brain, and brain health promotion. Dr. Nussbaum also serves as a consultant to different organizations and companies throughout the United States. Now, over the next hour, we're going to talk with Dr. Nussbaum about the relatively new frontier of brain health and what we can do as individuals to ensure our dynamic brains continue to have the capacity to reorganize and generate new brain cells. I'm Carol Barnes, and let's get started. Basically, want to know why don't we start with you explaining just sort of the basics of your brain?
Well, thanks for having me on, Carol. It's a great pleasure to be here with some friends in Orlando. And it's always wonderful for me to have the opportunity to talk about the single greatest miracle ever designed in the history of this universe or any, the human brain. It's our very identity. It's some basic facts. It weighs 2 to 4 pounds. It's comprised of 60% fat. Most people don't know this. It's actually the fattest part of you and the fattest part of me, Carol.
Now, I don't know if most women would agree with that part, but we'll get into that later on.
And every time your heart beats, 25% of the blood from that one heartbeat goes to this wonderful system, the human brain. That's how demanding it is.
And it really is, as you know, we talk about physical health and other aspects of that, which we'll do shortly. Yeah. You know, you think, is there really something I can do to take care of my brain?
Boy, there sure is. And that's the wonderful thing that we've learned in the past, it hasn't been that long, past decade or so, that the brain is this system that is dynamic, constantly reorganizing and malleable. It can be shaped by the environment. We do have some opportunity and responsibility to take care of our brains.
Now, I know we have a slide about the sections of the brain, and you know, so many times we'll talk about either, left brain, right brain, all of those details. So here we are.
Yes, this is known as the cortex. That is a word that translates to mean the bark of a tree. This is what most people think of when we say brain. So if you're at dinner tonight, Carol, and then the waiter comes over and you say, hey, I'm going to say a word, Charlie, you just tell me what you're thinking of. He's going to say that rumpled thing up top. But it's important for your audience to understand this is just one part of your brain. This is the conscious information processing system. If you look at the cortex, it evolved from the back to the front. This is the thing that weighs about 2 to 4 pounds. This is where brain health occurs, because this is where, when we expose our brains to environments that are stimulating, we develop certain types of parts of the brain cell that we're going to talk about today. But this is where brain health occurs. And you're right, there are 4 major areas, Carol. One is the occipital lobe. We call them lobes. If you don't like that word, we can say neighborhood. That's fine.
Oh, that works.
And that's where you see, actually in the back, even though your eyes are up front to the left. As you move a little bit forward, just sitting under each temple, you have an area called the temporal lobe.
Okay.
That's why we call it that. That's a very important structure for things such as learning and memory. That's an area of the brain where the auditory brain is. If you can kind of picture, the ears are kind of right there. Interestingly, that's an area the brain scientists are studying now to appreciate the relationship between God and the brain. And there's a whole field called neurotheology. How is it our brains appreciate a higher being? Unfortunately, that's an area of the brain, I'm sure some of your audience unfortunately may know someone or have someone in the family with what's called temporal lobe epilepsy.
Yes.
That's an area of the brain vulnerable to seizures. We don't know why, Carol. The parietal lobe, as you can see in the picture, is an area of the brain critically important for things such as you finding your way around the world, you being able to carry out mathematics. Einstein's brain was a little bit different than my brain, certainly in the parietal lobe. And there was an interesting study that just came out that said the number of connections between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe relates to intelligence. The frontal lobe, when I get out there and speak to the general public, which really my work is catered to, I try to convince people that the sexiest part of anyone is your frontal lobe. And they usually laugh about that.
I saw our audience kind of perk up on that part.
And the frontal lobe is kind of like the grand maestro. It's when you go see a symphony, there are humans up there playing different instruments. The maestro doesn't have an instrument, but he or she orchestrates everyone else what to do. You could lose a large section of your frontal lobe and intelligence won't be affected, but your frontal lobe tells every other area of the brain what we're going to do. It helps you organize. It helps you
Right.
structure your world. It helps you with routine. It's very analytic. It's where your personality is. So we can
it's-
blame it all on the frontal lobe.
So this kind of coordinates all of the other
That's
segments
right.
in there.
Exactly. Very important. Planning into the future. Think about that for a second. Being able to plan into the future, you know. So the frontal lobe, critically important. That's where a lot of behavioral issues come up in the clinical world.
So those are the basic segments of the
That's
brain.
right.
But now you tell me there are also two hemispheres. This is where we
Correct.
get into left and right.
Correct. And the brain has two sides. The fancy word is hemispheres. You're right, Carol. But again, I try to talk to the mothers and dads across the dinner table. Okay, so I'm not a rocket scientist. So I'm just going to talk plain English. You can say sides. You have a right side and a left side connected by a bridge. The technical term for the bridge is called a corpus callosum.
Right.
Now, there is some debate out there which suggests that the corpus callosum in the female is a little bit bigger, more robust than in the man. We think the reason for that, Carol, is that, and you and I are probably going to talk about this, is that the female brain processes information using both sides more often than the man.
Right. Well, this is what the slide says. It says both
Right.
sides of a woman's brain are used in processing language.
Correct.
A man's is more compartmentalized. Easy
Yeah.
for me to say. I could process language, I just couldn't say it. Is that why women tend to over talk things?
Women do, there's been some research done that women will speak more often and use more words during a day than men. This slide, which teaches us that females tend to process using both sides more than men, has a behavioral consequence. And it doesn't have to be catastrophic, but on a daily basis, we probably all would agree that men and women sometimes struggle with communication.
Right.
Surveys, Carol, have been done that indicate that corporate America loses thousands, if not millions of dollars because we're not communicating in the work site. Marriages are struggling out there because of communication issues, so it's not an academic point. I use this slide just for a quick second here for some fun, which is, and you got to have fun because
Right.
you only go around the racetrack once. This goes to why we probably have a voting gender gap in this country. Women vote
Really?
differently than men.
Yes, that's true.
If the females out there ask their favorite American male to define shopping, that's with an ing, Carol. That's
Okay.
an active verb, okay?
Okay.
Because men tend to utilize, not all men, but most men tend to utilize one side of their brain where the language is, where you have a task-oriented kind of approach to life, very task-oriented,
Yes.
we men. The American male will define shopping this way. I'm going to go into the mall in Orlando. I'm going to purchase what I'm there to get. And
Right.
I'm going to get out of that mall in 30 minutes.
As quickly as possible.
That's right. And
Done.
if it takes 31 minutes, Carol, I'm going psychotic, right? Now, the female can do that as well. Because
Yes, we can.
she also is task-oriented.
Right.
But she has this wonderful thing going on in her brain, which is the other hemisphere, it's non-language, where she'll walk into the mall, and
Yes.
lo and behold, she can appreciate music playing in the background.
Right.
She can smell the cinnamon rolls in the
We
distance.
can go up to the food court and stroll around. Absolutely.
You're being drawn to different textures. The male brain, we have a little fun, we show that other side, it's completely barren, okay? So that's not happening. And, you know, it's not uncommon for females to say about their male that they love, he doesn't listen to me. What about reading between the lines?
Right.
Men are on the lines. They're not even aware that there's things in between the lines. Okay, so the point is we're different animals. The good news is, because what you and I have already talked about, when the two brains get together, great things can happen. And we can shape the different brains to be more proactive, more healthy.
So there really is that sense of there is a difference between the male and female brain.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
we gotta champion
Scientific
it.
proof.
We got to champion it, yeah.
Absolutely. Now we move on to the cortex and subcortex.
Okay.
And now they're both very important, but then how do the two of them work together?
Yeah, they are both very important. And again, this is what comprises the miracle that is the human brain. The cortex sits up top. It's that rumpled structure we talked about, and those grooves and valleys, Carol. I like to tell people that the miracle of you emerges from those grooves and valleys. And I'll even
Really?
go so far as to speculate, now this is just speculation, that all the answers to our quandaries as a human race
Right.
lie within those grooves and valleys. The cure for cancer, the cure for Alzheimer's disease. We get so enthralled with the latest iPad, the iPod, all these things, all these gadgets outside of us. We got to turn inward. The cortex that we already talked about being a conscious information processor. The subcortex tends to help us with subconscious processing, very motor, procedural, routinized driven part of us.
Okay.
One example, if I may, just quickly. Your friends here today in the studio, and you and I, we got up this morning, and we do the typical thing we do as humans when we get up. We may race to go make a cup of coffee. We turn the
Yes.
TV on, and a wonderful thing happens along the way in the morning. We get dressed. People say, how does he know that? Well, people are dressed.
Right.
But it's not a conscious behavior.
Okay.
You're not in the middle of your room yelling out loud, honey, I've got my left pant leg on, I'm going for the right, how you doing over there? That's not what we do. But if you look at everybody and look at you, how nice you look today, and I'm looking pretty good, right,
Yeah.
Carol? The tie's on where it's supposed to be.
Everything's coordinated.
Everything's coordinated.
The shoes match.
Right, but it was all done subconsciously.
That's true.
Which is very interesting. You're right, the cortex and subcortex are connected. And if I may, Carol, so many of our listeners, unfortunately, are dealing out there with someone that they love who has Alzheimer's disease.
Yes.
Alzheimer's disease, the way I define it, is a brain that loses access to its life story. It tends to hit the cortex. Your listeners will also know, your audience also knows, Carol, diseases that hit the subcortex. Remember I said motor-based system. Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, multiple sclerosis. My point with this is that eventually both those disease processes will affect both this cortex and the subcortex because they're connected. There are a number of highways, if you will, connecting up those two systems. The brain operates like a symphony.
So would those diseases begin in either of those, the cortex or subcortex?
Yep, the
or?
Alzheimer's tends to hit that cortex.
Okay.
Eventually we'll go down and do some damage in the subcortex. Parkinson's disease, and probably much of your audience is familiar with at least. Huntington's, multiple sclerosis tends to start deeper in the brain in the subcortex and will eventually hit the cortex.
Moves out. Now, we've gone through, you know, the areas of the brain, the hemispheres, the lobes of the brain.
Yeah.
You have a slide coming up that if I used all my brain power right now, I would have no idea what it's all about. So it says, what is
There you
the
go.
word? Now, I took a little quick glance at that earlier,
Okay.
and I said, well, to me, that's kind of an off, you know, football goalpost picture, but what is the word?
That ain't a healthy goalpost there,
No,
Carol.
no, that's not good.
Well, yeah, and you're normal statistically, Carol, because
Thank goodness.
I was in an audience the other day with literally 1,000 people, and most people don't get this, okay? Let me try this one on you, though.
Okay, I'm
Can
ready.
I give you a clue?
Please.
Maybe it'll help.
I hope.
This is a word which is an animal. Can you tell me what the animal is by looking at that?
Well, it's not dog.
Correct.
It's not cat.
Correct.
It's not hamster.
You're right.
Well, there I'm out of animals.
Okay. What I've done from a brain perspective here, and I learned this some time ago myself, we are all very much driven by our language side of the brain. For most of us
Yes.
out there, that's the left side of our brain. It's called the dominant side because we respect language so much we call it dominant. What I have done is removed your ability to use that language side, and that's why it's so hard for people to read this word. The word is elephant. And my point
Okay,
with
wait
this,
a minute. Now, okay, go ahead.
and that's where people really get anxious because I can't see the elephant.
It's like, right?
But don't forget, letters have size and shape. And you see the E has a certain shape.
Yes.
The second letter is an L in elephant that has a shape, and you can follow it along with the
Sure.
different shapes. Now here's my point. Language is processed by your non-dominant side too, but the non-dominant side, Carol, appreciates the size and the shape of the letters. The dominant side, language side, will read the word, elephant.
Right.
But the point is, particularly when I talk to teachers, and I did that this week down in your great city of Orlando, we want to write with both uppercase and lowercase letters. Your dominant side will appreciate the letters. The non-dominant side will thank you for using different size and shape. We don't want to write in block lettering.
Oh, I see. So now that we look at this, it does make more sense.
Yeah.
So, you know, and you often talk about, you know, for brain exercises to
Yeah.
write with your non-dominant hand.
Correct.
Also, does that kind of...
Yeah, absolutely, because think about the two pathways into the two hemispheres you and I just talked about. They tend to be our hands, our arms, and our feet. Now, most of us out there have a dominant hand, a dominant eye, and
That's
a
right.
dominant leg. And we tend to rely on that. The best brain, the best most healthy brain, I think, is an ambidextrous brain. How do we develop an ambidextrous brain? We have to work with that side of our body that's less capable.
Oh, gosh. Well, we have just a few minutes to go in this segment. So the next is about brain cells, and we do hear about that, effects of pollution, effects of what you take in. How does the brain cell kind of basically work?
Yeah, we have trillions of brain cells, and they all connect with, they never touch another brain cell, but we think they can make connections with another, 10 to 30,000 brain cells. Think about that mathematically for a second.
Gosh.
Well, at the core, almost like the core of your body, the core of my body, you have what's called the nucleus. And coming out of the nucleus, if I may extend my arm for a second, we have a part of the brain cell called an axon.
Right.
I often get people to say it. They got to say these things out loud.
Axon.
That's right. You got to say these words.
See, that's not a familiar word that you would hear.
No, but it's you. We're describing really you and your audience and myself today. And the axon will take information from the cell body out, away from the cell body, into the world, trying to communicate with other brain cells. Now, the axon is insulated, like my arm is insulated by my suit coat, by fat. We talked about the brain being 60% fat.
Right.
Information is propelled quickly down the axon, Carol, if I have a lot of robust fat there. That's what the fat does for us. The other side of the brain cell, which is critically important, is called a dendrite.
Right.
I describe that to people as kind of branch-like figures, or almost fingers. And I want everyone to listen very closely to what I'm going to say now, because this is the foundation for brain health. When you expose your brain to an enriched environment, your brain will react. You don't have a choice. And it does so by developing more dendrites. The more dendrites you develop across your lifespan, the more brain reserve you have. The metaphor I use is for everyone to understand. If you're flying at 500 feet looking down at a jungle, the trees are so dense you can't see the land. Compare that to looking at a Caribbean island where there's one palm tree. And I'm not trying to be funny right now, but if you think of Alzheimer's disease as a weed whacker, Alzheimer's disease comes into the brain, Carol, and it'll wipe out the brain cells. We believe the more dendrites, the more brain reserve you have, the better off your brain is to fight off, delay the onset of things like Alzheimer's. We do not have a cure. We do not have prevention. But proactively, as we build brain reserve across our lifespan, that is what brain health is all about.
Well, we've spent these last few moments discussing your brain, and we're going to come into some really nuts and bolts in our next segment, what you can do to sustain brain health. Again, thank you, Dr. Nussbaum, but it's time for a short break.
Thanks, Carol.
And welcome back to the Vital Living Forum. With me today is Dr. Paul Nussbaum, and we're talking about brain health. Now, so many times we're told, if a brain cell is destroyed, that's it. There's no way to regenerate brain cells. So now you're telling me that there really is an area of the brain that you can regenerate cells.
That's right, and this is the exciting, thing to be interested in the human brain. It was in 1998, Carol, that a study came out that said the part of the human brain that can generate new brain cells is the hippocampus. Can the audience say that for me? Hippocampus.
Hippocampus.
Yeah, and like we talked about earlier, you want to say these things out loud. What I like to do is to make sure that everybody understands this is the most important part of who we are. And the reason is, it's the hippocampus, you have one on each side, that lays down your life story, that helps you learn new information. The hippocampus takes information in, hangs on to it. If you think it's important, it'll transition that information permanently, Carol.
Really?
Up into the cortex. And it's not random. This is the same thing we know to be true in animals. Back in the 1950s, this is not an opinion, this is a fact. We knew back in the 50s that rodents can generate new brain cells. The big trick was, is it true for humans? And it was in 1998 we think that occurred. Interestingly, when you expose your brain to that stimulating environment we talked about, I always use two words, novel and complex, your brain reacts, we talked about that. It'll do really nice things for you in the hippocampus. The other side of that, Carol, though, we've learned about in animals and in humans, when you're exposed to environments that are stressful, chronic stress, you'll have someone in front of you who has memory problems. And the reason is we think chronic stress, which really is caused by some hormones exploding in the body, steroid-like, can do damage to the hippocampus. One other thing about the hippocampus, it is the structure that gets hit very early with Alzheimer's disease. And for your caregivers out there, you know quite well, you have someone that you're caring for with Alzheimer's disease, that person forgets, and forgets rapidly. And the other thing they do is they repeat.
Yes.
If you think about a person who has to repeat, the hippocampus is broke. They can't take in new information, so they rely on the information that's already there, and they have to repeat. It can wear a caregiver out. The hippocampus, ladies and gentlemen, is the single greatest part of you. I want you to really appreciate that, all right? It's such a marvelous part of the brain.
Well, we go on from there to your emotional brain, and thinking about emotional now, is this different in men and women again?
Oh, absolutely. Again, we talked about earlier when women tend to be more verbal.
Right.
Part of emotion is the appreciation of what another person is providing you in terms of cues. I think you and I were talking and laughing about this a little bit earlier, Carol. And the female brain is set up to be more intuitive. Not all females, not all men, but the female brain tends to be set up to be more intuitive, more social. One of the greatest questions out there, to have a little bit of fun right now, ladies, the guys out there, you know, we get together and we ask that question, why is it that women all go to the restroom together? We just can't figure that out.
I can't give away that secret. It's no, I can't tell you why.
And they've done some surveys of young girls in school, and it tends to be a social event. Now, the guys out there know doggone well that we ain't going to any bathroom with a bunch of guys, right? And there's not a whole lot of conversation going on in the bathroom. Now, we use that as a practical, fun example, that we are different. But, you know, your brain, Carol, is set up, I heard it described to me one time as having kind of 3 layers, okay? And in your brain stem, which is deep in the brain, coming off the spinal cord, are where your drives are. Your drive for thirst and hunger and sexuality, fear and flight, survival, these kinds of things. Then as the second layer emerges, it's called the limbic system that a lot of you may have heard of. And that really sometimes is considered the emotional part of the brain, but I want you to think of it just as one part. And what happens there is experience that you have get attached to these drives, and you place emotional tags onto those experiences. So all the emotions you can think of get placed onto a different experience that you may be having. The amygdala, the hippocampus, you can see there, are all part of that limbic system. Now, if we just walked around and we were animals that just had drives and emotions, we'd be in big trouble, right? I mean, it'd be an interesting thing that we'd be observing out there. Unfortunately, we don't have that. We have the third layer, which is that frontal part of the brain, Carol, we talked about earlier. That's the part of your brain that says to you, for example, I'll pick on me, Paul, you really shouldn't do that right now. Take a deep breath. Don't say that. Walk away. Make a good decision. But like a 2-year-old who has a temper tantrum, I'm 47. Have you ever seen a 47-year-old have a temper tantrum? Okay. And so we have to apologize. And, you know, because we behave in a way that our frontal cortex didn't stop the behavior, essentially. And that's really what emotion is all about. Women tend to be able to express their emotions better than men, and women tend to be able to pick up on the emotion of others better than men. Leadership, you want to be a good leader, you better be able to empathize and pick up on the emotions of others.
And so we move on then to all of the research, the neuroplasticity and the human brain research is the next segment.
Yeah, everybody say plasticity.
Plasticity.
Your brain has plasticity. And the way that I describe that is it's not a rigid structure. Now, you, like me, maybe learned early on that your brain has this critical period of brain development. And then after that, I don't know what happens. It's all downhill, right? You remember learning about that? Well, it turns out that, you know, I was in front of a little baby last night who was just a wonderful little baby. He was 2 months old, and boy, that really is a critical period of brain development. It certainly is 0 to 6, 0 to 5 years, but you know what? I've got a mother who's 86. She's got a critical period of brain development too. Some of you may have a 100-year-old walking around. I'm 47. It's a critical period of my brain development too. The critical period of brain development is life. And plasticity, you guys said so well, really can be defined as a brain that's dynamic. It's not rigid. It's constantly reorganizing, and it's malleable, which means it can be shaped. We're going to talk about what shapes it, and environment does the shaping. You can shape the brain to be not so good, to be bad. You can shape the brain to be good, which is what really I'm all about, the good stuff in life, and health. So that's what plasticity is. The brain has plasticity, Carol.
And that's what we'll talk about shortly.
Right.
All of the different things people can do as far as exercise and you know, food and things. But
right, for health.
Neural energies.
Yeah.
What are
Neuroenergies.
This is kind of a Star Trek looking aspect.
Exactly. And what we want to talk about here is, for me anyway, the brain really is maybe not the final frontier. I got in a little trouble one time. A person came up to me and said, how can you say it's the final frontier? That's fair criticism, but it certainly is a new frontier. It's an exciting frontier. And as I said, I think as we learn about the power of your brain, it's an electrical source, it's a chemical source of energy. It's an energy source. You know, I've already gone out on a limb and I've said to you that the brain's going to be able to fix the maladies of the body one day. As we tap into this wonderful energy source, we're going to revolutionize civilization. I use the phrase neuroenergies to explain tapping into this brilliance that is our brain. You have to understand we're very primitive. People like me, we don't know a whole lot about the brain. We really don't. If anybody tells you they do, walk out of the room, okay? We don't know a lot about this. One thing I do know about the brain is we always underestimate its capacity. We really do. And we haven't given it enough attention and love like we need to. It is who you are. So neuroenergies really represents a frontier for us, a wonderful frontier.
And from there we move on to reserve theory. Now this looks like a lot of information on here.
Yeah, and let me just boil that down, Carol, because we did talk a little bit about this. This is the building up of brain reserve by exposing our brain to health-promoting environments, the complex and the novel, the stimulating, the enriched. We don't want to be rote and passive animals. Okay? And when we do engage in those types of complicated environments, cortex is stimulated, the dendrites are spawned, we build up more reserve. Remember, you and I described that as having a brain like a jungle. That's really what reserve is about. It's controversial, I tend to believe in it, and it's the thing that we think helps to push off the onset of clinical disease later in life. No prevention, no cure, but very powerful. There are things that you and I are going to talk about that actually help to build up reserve and actually have been shown to correlate with a reduction in the risk of something like Alzheimer's disease. Having more years in school, believe it or not, reduces the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Having a higher score in your occupation. The Department of Labor gives everybody a score. And you get a score, I get a score. They've done some studies. They've looked at folks across their life, what happens to them from a health perspective or disease perspective. The more complicated the job, more problem solving taking place in the job setting where we spend a lot of time. The healthier our brain is, because the occupation setting and the education setting are helping us build up brain reserve.
And now what's something that I've seen in your books, Save Your Brain, Your Brain Health Lifestyle, you have a wonderful, it's that pie chart of segments, and it's so easy, it's so simple, it's so many things that you don't really consider till you see it. This is what it means to become whole and have a completely whole, healthy brain. And we're gonna touch on these segments kind of quickly, but it's a great 5 segments.
Yeah, very briefly here. There's 5 major components to my brain health lifestyle: nutrition, socialization, physical activity, mental stimulation, and spirituality. We want to be integrated. We want to focus in on each of these slices of the brain health pie and work on our weaknesses.
And so let's start with socialization. Now, this is where, socialization, you become a social person, you don't, withdraw, you don't sit home. This is as we age, I think becomes more and more important that you get out and have a social life.
You really have really nailed it there, Carol. This is particularly important, as you say, for our older loved ones in our life. We don't want our older adults, our older friends, our older family members to isolate and segregate. A person that isolates and segregates is a brain that isolates and segregates. We'll therefore use our subcortex, no brain health there. We want to use our cortex. You got to have a reason for getting up each and every morning, a purpose in life.
A place to go, people to interact with.
Exactly. Having friends and family members is important. I don't advocate retirement because some people confuse retirement from work with retirement from life. You have to have a purpose in life each and every morning.
Absolutely. So moving on from that, the next section is physical activity. Now, we probably hear the most about that, that we stay active, we exercise, we do those 10,000 steps a day, things like that. Right.
And the reason is, as everybody should know by now with our interview, is that every time the heart beats, 25% of the blood goes to the brain. So it's a very narcissistic part of us, the human brain. Walking 10,000 steps daily, purchase a pedometer. Put it on your belt buckle, count up the steps you take each and every day. Dance has been shown to promote brain health, reduce the risk of dementia. So has knitting and gardening. Those are physical activities that have a cognitive thinking component to them. I do advocate something very simple like writing with your non-dominant hand. We talked about that earlier.
We did.
And aerobic exercise has been shown to help to reduce the risk of dementia, has been shown in kids, students, to increase their scores if they're physically active. I told you I was in a room filled with teachers here recently. Here's a little secret for everybody. You have no learning cells in your buttocks, all right? No learning cells in your buttocks. So we want to be up and moving in the classroom to help propel learning, which is what we want for our young kids.
And too, what I like about this slide is you do have things like knitting or gardening, because so many times people may think they have, they might have a physical limitation or something, they'll say, well, I can't get up and, ride a bike or play golf or something, but there are physical things they can do.
Absolutely. Stay physically active.
And going right along with that, mental stimulation. Now, of course, we hear about doing crossword puzzles and things like that, but there's a lot more people can do.
There certainly is, and again, no cure, no prevention, but there's things proactively we can do. Learning a second language. You don't have to be proficient. Sign language. Babies, before they can speak orally, can learn about 20 signs. By the second grade, they have better articulatory abilities, and they have a higher IQ. The reason a higher IQ is important for what you and I are talking about today, Carol, is that a higher IQ early in life reduces the risk of dementia later in life. Travel reduces the risk of dementia. When the audience goes home today, you've already got the mental map laid out. You're going to be able to do 2 or 3 things you shouldn't, but you will be able to while you're driving.
Right.
If you come home with me to Pittsburgh, it's a new environment. So your cortex will be used. You'll have to be much more involved with where you are. Playing board games. You all remember this. We all grew up with Monopoly and Scrabble and those kind of games. Today we have the computer, so there are new companies that have been built called fitbrains.com as one example.
That is a good website.
Carol, do your mental workout every day online. Exercise your memory, your language, your visual spatial skills, and FitBrains is a good one. Power of music. It will move the human being. It's called dance. Other animals don't move when they hear music. It also soothes people. It can help with mood. In Alzheimer's disease, when they're no longer able to communicate, music has been an avenue, Carol, to reconnect them with their loved ones. Even surfing the web. I have a friend out at UCLA who's looking at what happens in the brains, for example, of our kids when they Google. And it appears to be health promoting in a lot of ways relative to even reading. So there's some wonderful things. We see the same thing in older adults who surf the web. Can be very brain health promoting.
And there too, again, being at a computer, if there are physical limitations, this is another possibility to keep your brain active.
Exactly. Now, also to reconnect socially.
And again, we come to spirituality, and I think this may be the component that most folks don't kind of quite understand how that may come into play.
Yeah, and it's an interesting and important one. Animals exposed to environments that are too stimulating, their brain stops developing. We already talked about what happens to our brains with chronic stress. It's not good for the brain. So we have to be able as humans to slow down. One thing about Americans, we're going too fast. Americans have a hard time even giving themselves 30 minutes a day, Carol.
Or taking vacations.
Goodness gracious, we take 2 weeks and we think we are the cat's meow, right? Learning relaxation procedures, deep breathing through the nose, holding it in the stomach and out through the mouth rhythmically. Learning how to meditate is not so foreign anymore in America. 10 years ago we made fun of people. Now it's not so foreign. You can tie in Tai Chi and yoga there. Prayer on a daily basis enhances the immune system. This gets us into neurotheology. One thing I can tell people, and I didn't learn this in a textbook, Carol, where I go to work weekly in faith-based institutions, I deal with brains that are very distressed. Alzheimer's disease can cause the brains to be chaotic and behaviorally disruptive. We take them off their locked unit, remember that phrase, place them into a large hallway where there may be some religious symbolism, and in walks a human being who's a religious leader. That person who was chaotic and behaviorally dysfunctional in the locked unit can sit still for 30, 35 minutes. We don't have medication that does that. What's the side effect? I have to take them back to the locked unit. In medicine, we haven't understood the power of what we're talking about right here to bring calm and quality of life to brains that are experiencing chaos. Just the ability to say no. And one little thing that I do advocate is have a family meal once a day.
I loved that. I saw that in your book, that it's the social, it's the nutritional, which we'll talk about in just a second. It's a wonderful, stimulating, calming social time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And with that meal, we go to nutrition.
That's right.
This one we probably hear the most about, what you should take, what's good brain foods.
And we have discovered, Carol, and as you know, what we eat does impact the structure of our body, including the brain, and the function. We know that the brain is comprised of 60% fat. We talked about that. So we have to get the good fats in our body and in our brain. What are those? Those are the omega-3 fatty acids. We find omega-3 fatty acids in fish, salmon, herring, mackerel, tuna, sardines. For people behaviorally who don't like fish, they don't consume enough fish, you got to go to a supplement. Now, I'm not a big supplement guy. But
Okay.
one of the leading supplements out there that you hear a lot about, Carol, is fish oil and the
Right.
omega-3s. At the same time, we have to increase our antioxidants. That's a fancy phrase that most people get scared of. That's just fruits and vegetables.
Right.
They rid your body of poisons and toxins called free radicals. We have to eat 5 fistful servings of fruits and vegetables a day. The other side of it, Carol, is we have to reduce the bad fats, trans fats, processed foods, stay away from the fast foods. Eat with your utensils, you eat less, you'll eat healthier than if you use your fingers.
And so we're actually going to take a quick break. You've seen all of these wonderful aspects of becoming whole. But yes, it is time for another break. But before we go, I'd like you to pull all 5 components together of the brain health. And as we've seen, the nutrition, the socialization, help me out with this,
Keep going. Yeah, you got it.
mental stimulation,
Stimulation.
physical activity,
Right.
and spiritualization.
Right.
There they are, and that's what it means to become whole. We'll be coming back in just a couple of moments. And welcome back. I'm delighted to be talking with Dr. Paul Nussbaum about the concept of brain health. Now, the next part is maintaining your life story. And you've talked about how we the different areas of our brain affect how we process what happens in our lives. So how do we basically maintain our life story?
Yeah, the proactive journey towards brain health is one that begins in the womb and goes to our last breath. And I really use the concept of maintaining access to your life story to capture for me on an emotional level, Carol, what happens when you're in front of someone with Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease technically is a lot of things that I could explain to the audience, but for me, really, it is a brain that's lost access to its life story. So the person with Alzheimer's can no longer share wonderful memories from their autobiography, the most precious gift they have, their life story, with their little ones, their grandchildren. And so what I like to tell people out there is that every one of us, including me, has an invisible bag that goes with us every day. And into that invisible bag, we place life experiences. It's with us today. And we're building up our wonderful autobiography. And if you think about today as your twilight, that may not be a good thought or a positive thought, but it's maybe a realistic one, because that's all we have is today. Just before the sun sets, a little one will come up to you and take you by your hand and look you square in the eye and say to you, share with me your life story. I want to know. And so that's the personal message here today that's so important about brain health. We don't have any guarantees, but what we've talked about is this proactive course, this brain health lifestyle with the 5 components